I never imagined I would be in such a situation. For years, my husband, Mark, and I shared a relatively ordinary marriage. We were the couple who seemed perfectly fine at family gatherings, smiling in pictures, hosting barbecues, and taking occasional weekend trips. But beneath that polished exterior, we carried our share of secrets and unmet desires. Mark always had a penchant for pushing boundaries. He was charming but unpredictable, with a thrill-seeker's heart that often pulled us into adventures I would have otherwise avoided. Over time, his interests began to drift into more unconventional areas, especially in the bedroom. I dismissed most of it at first, thinking it was simply a phase. One evening, after a couple of glasses of wine, Mark sat me down. He brought up the idea of exploring fantasies together, which didn't seem unusual at first. But then he mentioned something specific. He wanted to see me with other men, too, in fact. And not just any men. He had already been speaking with two strangers he had met online, both of whom were intrigued by the idea. I was stunned. Mark had always been confident, but this was a step beyond anything I'd anticipated. The thought made me uncomfortable. Yet, I'll admit, there was also a flicker of curiosity. Mark emphasized that it wasn't about replacing or diminishing our connection, but about trying something new, something daring. After days of hesitation and more than a few heated arguments, I agreed. Looking back, I wonder if it was my desire to please him or my own yearning for something different that led me to say yes. The night arrived, and my nerves were on edge. The two men, Andre and Malik, were nothing like I had expected. Polite, respectful, and surprisingly understanding of my hesitation. They reassured me that everything would proceed only if I felt comfortable. Mark was there the entire time, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of excitement and reassurance. The experience itself is difficult to describe. It was overwhelming, surreal, and, to my surprise, not as humiliating as I had feared. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of liberation. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was about letting go of control, about surrendering to a moment I never thought I'd encounter. In the aftermath, Mark and I sat together in silence. I felt a mixture of emotions, relief, confusion, and a lingering sense of guilt. Mark held my hand and assured me that he loved me more than ever. For him, the night had been about trust, about seeing me embrace something he knew I would never consider otherwise. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself questioning everything. Was this really what I wanted, or had I allowed myself to be swept into Mark's fantasy at the expense of my own boundaries? This is a story of infidelity, yes, but not in the way you might think. It's about infidelity to oneself. The moment you compromise who you are to fit someone else's desires. Mark and I are still navigating what this means for our marriage, and while I don't have all the answers, I know this. Trust and love are complicated, and sometimes the lines between right and wrong blur in ways you never thought possible. As the weeks passed, the aftermath of that night began to seep into every corner of my life. I found myself replaying the evening over and over in my head, trying to make sense of what it meant for me, for us, for our marriage. Mark seemed almost giddy in the days following. He was attentive, affectionate, and unusually upbeat, as though the experience had rejuvenated something in him. He often asked how I felt about it, but his questions came with an unspoken expectation that I would validate his feelings, assure him that everything was fine, and maybe even agree to do it again someday. But I wasn't fine. What I didn't expect was how much it would change my perception of myself. Before that night, I thought I knew who I was, a loyal wife, someone who prioritized stability and tradition over spontaneity. That night, however, had shattered those boundaries, leaving me feeling unmoored. A part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, while another part felt hollowed out, as if I'd lost something vital in the process. I started avoiding Mark's questions, brushing them off with vague responses. At work, I struggled to focus, haunted by the memory of my own actions and the weight of my choices. I couldn't decide if I hated him for what he'd asked me to do or if I hated myself for agreeing to it. One evening, After another strained dinner where Mark talked animatedly while I barely said a word, he finally confronted me. "You're not okay, are you?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. I put down my fork and looked at him. "I don't know, Mark. I really don't. You said this was about trust, about us trying something new together. But I feel lost. Like I betrayed myself to make you happy." His face fell, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said quietly. "I thought it would bring us closer." "Closer?" I echoed, shaking my head. "I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore, or who we are." The conversation opened a floodgate of emotions. Mark admitted that he had been chasing an idealized version of intimacy, one that he thought could reignite our spark. He had convinced himself that involving others would strengthen our bond rather than fracture it. But what about me? I wasn't just a participant in his fantasy. I was a person with my own needs, fears, and boundaries. And somewhere along the way, those had been disregarded. Over the next few weeks, we sought counseling, something we should have done long before that night ever happened. The sessions were painful but necessary. I learned to articulate my feelings, to express the anger and sadness I'd buried for years. Mark, too, began to see the toll his desires had taken on me, on us. Our marriage is far from perfect, and I don't know what the future holds. But I've learned one crucial lesson. Love doesn't mean sacrificing your sense of self. Boundaries matter, and so does the ability to say no, even to someone you deeply care about. For now, we're taking it one day at a time, rebuilding trust and figuring out what intimacy means for both of us. It's not easy, but it's honest. And after everything, I think that's a start. In the months that followed, Mark and I focused heavily on rebuilding the foundation of our marriage. The cracks that had been there long before that fateful night were now impossible to ignore. Counseling became a regular part of our lives, not just as a couple, but individually as well. For me, therapy was like holding up a mirror to my soul. I began to see the patterns I had fallen into, not just with Mark, but throughout my life. I had always been a people pleaser, someone who prioritized others' needs above my own. That night wasn't the first time I had ignored my discomfort for the sake of someone else's happiness, but it was certainly the most extreme example. In one session, my therapist asked a simple but profound question. "What do you want?" I didn't have an answer. That question stayed with me, gnawing at my thoughts. I started journaling, writing down everything I felt but had been too afraid to say. I wrote about the excitement, the shame, the resentment, and the deep longing for something I couldn't quite name. Over time, I realized that what I wanted wasn't tied to any single event or experience. What I wanted was to feel whole again. Mark, on the other hand, had his own revelations. He admitted that his fantasies had been a way of masking his fear of monotony, his dread of growing older and feeling irrelevant. He'd been chasing thrills to fill a void he didn't fully understand. In one particularly emotional session, he turned to me and said, "I didn't just hurt you. I think I hurt us both, and I don't know how to fix it." It was a turning point for us. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were finally being honest, not just with each other, but with ourselves. Our relationship didn't magically heal overnight. Trust is fragile, and rebuilding it takes time. Some days, we felt like strangers, navigating a minefield of emotions. Other days, we found glimmers of the love that had once brought us together. We set new boundaries, ones that were clear and mutually agreed upon. I made it clear that I needed my voice to matter, that my comfort and autonomy were non-negotiable. Mark, to his credit, respected that. He stopped pushing for things I wasn't ready for and focused instead on reconnecting with me in simpler, more genuine ways. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie, he took my hand and said, "I don't deserve you, but I'm grateful you're still here." Tears welled up in my eyes. "I'm still here because I believe we can be better," I said. "But we have to want it, both of us." That's where we are now. Two flawed people trying to navigate the complexities of love, trust, and desire. The road ahead is uncertain, and there are no guarantees. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that true intimacy isn't about grand gestures or daring adventures. It's about showing up for each other, even when it's hard. And it's about showing up for yourself, too. For now, that's enough. In the year following that pivotal moment in our marriage, life settled into something resembling normalcy, but it wasn't the same. Normalcy after such a seismic shift meant creating a new normal, one that acknowledged our past without letting it define us. Mark and I continued therapy for much longer than we initially expected. We learned to communicate in ways we had never tried before, delving deep into the fears, insecurities, and unmet needs that had driven us to the edge. Therapy didn't just teach us to talk. It taught us to listen, to truly hear and understand each other without judgment or defensiveness. For me, the most challenging part was learning to reclaim my sense of self. I had spent so much of my life defining myself in relation to others, first as a daughter, then as a wife. But who was I beyond those roles? What did I enjoy? What dreams had I set aside? I started small, exploring hobbies I had always been curious about but never pursued. I joined a local art class, finding unexpected solace in painting. The act of creating something with my hands felt empowering, like a reminder that I could shape my world in ways I hadn't considered before. Mark supported me in these endeavors, though I could see the occasional flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was learning to give me space while grappling with his own insecurities. It wasn't easy for him to let go of the dynamic we had shared for so long, where he often took the lead and I followed. But as I grew, so did he. Mark began to confront the roots of his desires, tracing them back to a deep-seated fear of stagnation. He admitted that he had always equated excitement with value, believing that a life without thrills was a life wasted. It took time, but he started to see that fulfillment could come from quieter, more meaningful moments, from the way we laughed over breakfast or held hands during an evening walk. Our physical intimacy also went through a period of recalibration. After that night, there was an unspoken tension between us, a fear that any misstep could reopen old wounds. We approached each other carefully, relearning what it meant to be vulnerable. It wasn't just about desire anymore. It was about connection. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Mark turned to me with a hesitant smile. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked softly. I hesitated, not sure how to respond. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not in the way you might think." "What do you mean?" "I think about how it forced us to face things we've been avoiding. It wasn't just about the act itself. It was about everything it revealed. About me, about you, about us." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you regret it?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I regret not standing up for myself sooner. I regret letting things get to that point. But I don't regret the lessons we've learned since then." That seemed to comfort him. Our marriage is still a work in progress, and perhaps it always will be. The truth is, no relationship is ever truly static. It ebbs and flows, shaped by the choices we make and the challenges we face. What matters now is that we're both committed to growth, not just as a couple, but as individuals. We've learned that love isn't about perfection or living up to an ideal. It's about showing up even when it's messy and uncomfortable. And most importantly, it's about never losing sight of who you are, even in the midst of love.
As the seasons changed, so did we. The days of tension and unease between Mark and me gradually gave way to something softer, more understanding. It wasn't as though we had forgotten what happened, but the sharp edges of those memories had dulled. They were no longer a source of pain, but a reminder of how far we had come. One of the most surprising changes came from how we approached our relationship with openness. Before, Mark and I had been trapped in a silent dance of assumptions and unspoken expectations. Now we talked, really talked. No topic was too difficult or off-limits. One night, while sitting on the patio under a blanket of stars, Mark broached a subject I hadn't expected. "I know we've come a long way, he began, his voice steady but cautious. But do you ever think about exploring things again? Not the same way we did before, but in a way that feels right for both of us. I sipped my tea, considering his words. I've thought about it, I admitted. Not because I want to relive that night, but because I wonder if there's a way to redefine what intimacy means for us. Something that feels safe. Something we both agree on. It was a pivotal conversation. For the first time, we weren't talking about fantasies as something to fulfill one person's desires at the expense of the other. Instead, we were exploring them as a shared journey, a way to deepen our connection without losing ourselves in the process. We didn't rush into anything. Months passed as we continued to focus on building trust and rediscovering the joy in being together. We took weekend trips to places we'd never been, laughed over silly card games, and spent long afternoons simply enjoying each other's company. Eventually, we decided to explore the idea of adding new dimensions to our intimacy, but this time with clear boundaries and mutual respect. It wasn't about recreating the past. It was about forging a new path, one where both of us felt seen, valued, and loved. Our first step was attending a workshop on relationship dynamics and open communication. It was eye-opening to be in a room with other couples who had their own stories, struggles, and triumphs. Hearing their perspectives helped us feel less isolated in our journey. The process wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, fear, and even jealousy. But instead of avoiding those feelings, we faced them head-on, talking through each one until we reached a place of understanding. Through it all, I discovered a strength I didn't know I had. I learned to advocate for myself, to voice my needs and desires without fear of rejection or judgment. Mark, too, grew in ways I hadn't anticipated. He became more attuned to my emotions, more willing to compromise and let go of his need to control the narrative of our relationship. One night, as we lay in bed, Mark turned to me and said, I never thought we'd get here. But I'm so glad we did. I feel like I love you more now than I ever have before. I smiled, tears prickling my eyes. Me too, I whispered. Our journey hasn't been perfect, and it never will be. But it's ours, messy, complicated, and uniquely beautiful. We've learned that love isn't about erasing mistakes or pretending they never happened. It's about using those mistakes to grow, to build something stronger and more resilient. For the first time in a long while, I feel hopeful. Not just for our marriage, but for myself. I know who I am now, and I know that I deserve a love that honors that person. And so, we move forward, two imperfect people, learning every day how to love each other and ourselves a little better than we did the day before. As Mark and I stepped into this new phase of our relationship, we discovered something unexpected: peace. For so long, we had been chasing excitement, novelty, and validation, but in our pursuit of those things, we had overlooked the simple joys of quiet connection. We didn't stop growing. If anything, we grew more deliberate about the choices we made, whether they were small decisions like how to spend a Saturday afternoon or bigger conversations about what the future might hold. But there was no rush, no pressure to make every moment monumental. One of the most profound changes was the way we embraced vulnerability. Before, vulnerability had felt like a risk, something to avoid for fear of judgment or rejection. Now, it was a strength we leaned into. One evening, as we sat on the living room floor surrounded by old photo albums, Mark picked up a picture of us on our wedding day. "You are so beautiful," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. I smiled, running my fingers over the glossy surface. We were so young. We had no idea what we were getting into. And yet, here we are, he said, looking at me with an intensity that made my heart ache. I don't think I've ever loved you more than I do now. Hearing those words, I realized how much had changed, not just between us, but within me. I no longer needed his validation to feel secure in our relationship. I was secure because I had found myself, and in doing so, I had found a way to love him more fully. The journey wasn't without its tests. One evening, while sorting through our shared email account, I stumbled across an old thread from the time when Mark had first begun reaching out to those men. It wasn't the content that startled me. It was the realization of how far we'd come since then. When I showed it to him, his face clouded with regret. "I should have deleted those," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No. It's a part of our story. It's messy and complicated, but it's ours. And look at where we are now." Mark reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. "I don't ever want to forget how much we've worked for this. I'm proud of us. Proud of you." It was in those moments, the raw, unfiltered honesty, that I felt the deepest sense of connection. As time went on, we began to see our journey not as something to be ashamed of, but as a testament to our resilience. We started sharing bits of our story with close friends, hoping to inspire others who might be struggling in their own relationships. Eventually, I began writing about our experiences not under my real name, but as a way to process everything we had been through. It was cathartic, weaving our story into words that others could connect with. Mark supported me wholeheartedly, even encouraging me to publish a small collection of essays. Life, as it turns out, doesn't offer tidy resolutions. There are no perfect endings, only new beginnings. Mark and I are still learning, still growing, and still choosing each other every day. And for me, the greatest revelation has been this: love isn't about avoiding mistakes or pain. It's about how you rise from them. It's about the courage to face yourself and your partner, to forgive, to heal, and to try again. Looking back, I wouldn't have chosen the path we took. But I wouldn't trade the lessons it taught us for anything. Because now I know what love truly means. And it's enough.